this looks like a great lunch, so thanks for joining us. We're going to have Dr. Cloud kick us off by covering some things that he and I realized after class last week we forgot to say. So you wouldn't expect anything less from us. So take it over.
The reason that I got involved years ago, looking at the life of Moses' education that led us to last week's lesson, was because of Acts 7:22. All the things we're trying to do are actually restated there in Acts 7:22, and then I was at fault last week. I left it out. It was going to be the end of our lesson, showing you that here the New Testament is telling us that. So this is Acts 7:22 tells us in just a very, very short number of words about what we talked about last week. We got especially the last part when Stan did Moses' education, why God put him there. So you can see the different ways. It's the different versions. I looked at about 25 versions and educated in all the wisdom, taught all the wisdom. It was taught, was instructed in all the wisdom. Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. And then there's one better than all of that.
And your favorite, right here.
Right, and this is right here. The best education. And that was one of the interesting things we're doing. And the CEV version actually really, really brought that out. So I just said, we just can't leave that out. We've got to start this week with that. And then actually, Stan's going to have a passage coming up. I guess the next passage is going to be Hebrews.
Yeah, and I actually agree with Dr. Cloud. Make no mistake, we're not trying to say, well, we're saying things up here, and we're trying to convince you that what we're saying is truthful only because we have a scripture for it. But we should have included this scripture simply because it says Moses was given the best education in Egypt, and he was a strong man and a powerful speaker, which the New Testament is upholding what we were saying would have been true, which makes the story of Moses even that much more interesting when he tells God, well, I'm not a good speaker. I don't think I can do what you're asking me to do. And yet he was educated better than probably anybody else to do just that. So it really is New Testament evidence for themes that are in the Old Testament, even if there's not an Old Testament verse that says it as succinctly as the New Testament verse does. And that's why we want to include it. Similarly, Hebrews 11, which you may already be aware of, some label it the heroes of the Old Testament chapter of Hebrews. And on the part that I just included for Moses, this is verse 23 through 29 of the New English translation. Interesting statements. By faith, when Moses was born. Now, we've heard all the things Moses did in faith, but by faith, when Moses was born, his parents hid him for 3 months because they saw the child was beautiful and they were not afraid of the king's edict. And by faith, when he grew up, Moses refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be ill-treated with the people of God than to enjoy sin's fleeting pleasure. He regarded abuse suffered for Christ. Well, that's strange. He didn't know Christ when he suffered the abuse, right?
Yes, he didn't understand everything that was going on, I'm sure. But that summarizes it well, and it really shows where his heart was.
Yeah, and in the Greek there, it's actually the word Christos, for Christ. And again, we're looking at the Old Testament now from the New Testament and from a writer that knows Jesus probably better than anybody. And so, found that interesting. That's why I highlighted it for you. If that catches you off guard or you need to study that this afternoon, feel free to do so. But he regarded abuse suffered for Christ to be greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for his eyes were fixed on the reward. And by faith he left Egypt without fearing the king's anger, for he persevered as though he could see the one who is invisible. And of course we know from the story that God let him see the backside of him when he hit him in the cliff of the rock. So he did kind of see the invisible, partially. But he lived his whole life like he could see the invisible. And by faith, he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood so that the one who destroyed the firstborn would not touch them. And by faith, they crossed the Red Sea as on dry ground. But when the Egyptians tried it, they were swallowed up. And so we thought, there's the encapsulated story of the entire Exodus in just 4 verses in the New Testament, right? Just a closing kind of book-ending thought for why we're doing this. So now, with that, we go to what we promised you, and we once again sort of overreached. We promised Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John today, and we spent about, who knows how many hours between individual study and then yesterday in a Zoom session where we put all this together, and we said, you know what, we're either going to have to talk really fast or not do a very good coverage job of all 4. So we decided just to do Matthew and Mark, and we'll do Luke and John next week. But the New Testament authors start with Matthew, right? That's how our Bibles are organized anyway. But we're always trying to bring you things in this class that I told Cheryl this morning on the way, I was really excited today to teach with you because you push me on things that I see and study that maybe by being so much younger than you, people would go, I don't know. But when you confirm them, then all of a sudden you give me credibility. So I appreciate that because we're trying to bring you things that you may not know or at least you haven't thought about. If we just bring you the same old, you're going to be like, well, here we go. We just checked a box on doing a class. But when we're doing some of these things, like for example, Matthew's unique theological presentation of Jesus' identity and work shows how Jesus is the new and greater Moses. Well, isn't that interesting? We just looked at Moses in detail and his education and all that he was doing and what he did and how he led God's people out of liberation and enslavement to Egypt and to Pharaoh. And Jesus is so much better and greater than that because he has the education and the ability to speak and to do all those things even before we realize he is God himself. And he leads his people out of enslavement to death and to sin. And he's the new and greater David who fulfills Old Testament hopes by establishing God's covenant and kingdom. This account of the gospel, I should have changed that one. This account of the gospel invites us to know and worship Jesus who makes all things new.
Well said. Well said.
Aha. Okay. Well, then going on in Matthew, the original composition, here's one of the things that Dr. Cloud can put more in it. He's forgotten more about it than I'm going to tell you probably. But what I've learned from taking Hebrew and looking at books in the Old Testament, as we call it, like Genesis, for example, not the name of the Hebrew book. It's actually named in the beginning. Or Deuteronomy, not the name of the book. Actually, the name of the book is, these are the words. But somewhere in church history and in the classes you offer on how we got the Bible, we end up explaining how we arrive at what we have between the covers of our Bibles today. Right. And so Matthew would have been something like the Gospel according to Matthew. It would not have been something like the Gospel according to Matthew. Instead, the opening verse functioned as the title like it does in the Hebrew book of the Bible. So before we worry about the Gospel according to Matthew or Matthew, just a single word, it would be more helpful to remember that, like in the Hebrew, the Greek would have had an opening phrase that might have been something like a record of the ancestors of Jesus the Messiah, or an account of the origins of Jesus the Messiah, or the book of the beginning of Jesus the Messiah. Thoughts?
Yeah, many of our names in our Bible come from the Old Testament, especially comes from the Greek translation. The first translation that we know of ever made of the Old Testament was into Greek. And Alexandria, Egypt, we call it the LXX, the 70, we call it the Septuagint, call it the Greek Old Testament. And the writers there the translators decided to name the first book instead of in the beginning, as Hebrew did, Bereshit, just one word in Hebrew. They called it Genesis or Genesis. And then sometimes, rather than doing that, they would name it they would follow the Hebrew, like Samuel. His first and second Samuel was just Samuel. It was just one long scroll, and it got divided into two scrolls later on. And so, so a lot of the names come, and then occasionally they get translated into Latin, and that Latin name would hang on. And finally, when our English Bible finally is put together, these names have come down and become standard for us.
Well, if I'm not mistaken, even the word you keep using, Bible, comes from Greek biblios. And the Hebrews would not have referred to their scrolls as Bible because they didn't know that word. They would have referred to it as the Holy Scriptures or as it's written in the Word of God, right?
Yeah, there was a city called Byblos on the coast, eastern coast of the Mediterranean, in the area of Syria there. And one of the words that developed was, as Stan said, Byblos. And then there's another one, Biblion, and the plural of that is Biblia. And our word Bible means a group of scrolls, is where it actually came from. And I'm sure that's exciting, but anyway.
Some people look excited and some don't. So we'll go with the excited looking people. All right, Donna, you said I had to work in some comedy. So here's some comedy. While we're looking at the accounts of the evangelists, Dr. Cloud even laughed out loud yesterday when I put this on the screen while we were in Zoom. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, see me after class. Your book reports are surprisingly similar. That is something we don't normally talk about. We put this in here because 2,000 plus years later, here we are sitting in a context where everybody throws litigious paperwork at each other on who owns stuff, right? If I write a song, and maybe you've got your little Shazam program on your phone, and the song's playing over the local restaurant PA, and you do Shazam, it'll tell you who wrote the song, who owns it, and who you have to pay if you play it and listen to it, right? Unless you buy the rights to own the album to play the song yourself. We have organizations that do things like running around checking on copyright infringement and whether or not people are being rightfully paid for the intellectual property or the creative property that they've made. Not true in the first century. They were more concerned about getting everybody the news about Jesus and the good news than whose news it belonged to or who owned it, because they saw it as God owned it, not them. And so that's one of the reasons Matthew, Mark, and Luke have so much similarity, right?
Correct.
And furthering this for you, Donna, is this one, if I can get the button to work. If y'all don't pay attention, we're going to end up with 4 different versions of this miracle, right? Because we also see in some of the gospel accounts, wait a second, that's a little bit different. It either happens in a different order, even though it's the same story, or some of the details about the story seem to be more specific in Matthew and Luke than they seem to be in Mark, for example, which Dr. Cloud's going to talk about here in a minute. So see, we can be funny. Generally speaking then, gospel authorship. Why would we even bring that up? Well, we always try to do everything we do with improving ourselves on how we say things because words are very important and how we communicate to people is very important. It needs to be clear, but it also needs to say what we're meaning for it to say and not infer things that we don't mean. So if we tell you everything we just told you and then we say things like Matthew's gospel, well, that would cause me anyway to pause and say, well, wait a second, what does that mean? That means Matthew's good news? As if Matthew has good news differently than Mark has good news? But if we turn it around with what we're suggesting to you this morning, it is the good news. It is the gospel according to Matthew's recount of it or recollection of it or his inspired task that God gave him with the gospel. And you could say that about Mark, and you could say that about Luke, and you could say that about John. And this slide's saying that. After 4 accounts of the gospel, not plural, but the good news, were collected as a group in the 2nd century AD, titles were added to distinguish them from each other. Church tradition supplied these names since the authors are not named in the text, which we're going to see here in a minute. They are slight variations in form of the gospel in the Greek manuscripts, but the same names and the same Greek preposition according to whoever the author is is always included. But somewhere along the way, we dropped that in our English Bibles, and we just simply have a dude, Dr. Musgrave's term, a dude's name.
Yeah. It's like the book of Acts. The Greek name for the book of Acts is Acts of some of the apostles. Because you think, well, why didn't it talk about the others? A lot of the apostles are not mentioned in the book of Acts. The first 12 chapters, other than a chapter when Paul is converted, Saul is converted, is devoted to Peter, heavily Peter. With John gets in there a little bit. And then the last half of the book of Acts is talking about Paul. So it's really, the title is Some Acts of Certain Apostles. That's what it is. But your Acts of Apostles make you think this is going to be covering all the apostles, but they do not all appear.
Yes, Thomas and Thaddeus never even get to be mentioned.
Right.
Yeah. So more on Matthew then. Matthew is the first book of the New Testament traditionally, and it is traditionally attributed to the Apostle Matthew. So we're not saying anything that's trying to blow your heads up or take you away from what you were thinking before this class started. On the other hand, the gospel according to Matthew contains more teachings of Jesus than any other gospel. Here's some of the similarities, but the distinct differences. With well-known passages, including the Beatitudes in chapter 5, which is part of Sermon on the Mount, the Lord's Prayer in chapter 6, or probably better named the model prayer that Jesus shows us how to pray, the Golden Rule in chapter 7, the Great Commission that we've based our entire sermon series for 2023 on occurs in one account of the good news, Matthew. Don't know if you ever noticed that before, but there is no Great Commission in Mark, Luke, or John. So Matthew is the only gospel to record the visitation of the Magi, for example. We would call them the wise men. The renaming of Simon as Peter, and the parables of the wheat and the tares, or the wheat and the weeds, depending on which word you want to use there, and the sheep and the goats. In nearly every known manuscript of the New Testament, Matthew is placed first. So the question is, why? And we'll get to that in a second. The text of Matthew provides few autobiographical insights about Matthew as a person. The name Matthew occurs only 2 times in the entire book or the entire narrative of Matthew, and neither occurrence identifies him as the author. The first occurrence comes when Jesus calls Matthew the tax collector to follow him in chapter 9, verse 9. And the passage is largely dependent upon Mark, which Dr. Cloud is going to talk about here in a minute, except Mark identifies the tax collector as Levi, son of Alphaeus, not Matthew, son of Alphaeus, even though we know that they're the same person. The second reference to Matthew is in chapter 10, verse 3, and it's a list of the 12 disciples or the 12 apostles, and we see that Matthew is among them. The list in Matthew differs, however, from parallels in Mark chapter 3, verse 16, and Luke chapter 6, 15, and also compare, as Dr. Cloud was talking about, in Acts 1:13, in its identification of Matthew as the tax collector. So really, we find out about what Matthew's vocation was, and we find out about the few things we know about Matthew in Matthew, and maybe that's why they decided to think that that's probably who wrote it. But other than that, there's nothing in there that tells us anything about authorship. So here's the question: why is it placed first then? Well, I suspect, and this is just Stan speaking, even though I think you agree, I suspect Matthew was most likely written to a Christian community with a strong Jewish heritage. And if we look at the scriptures, they answer the question for us on why the church fathers and the people who organized and placed the Bible in the way we have it published today probably put it, is Romans 1:16 tells us that, Paul says that he's not ashamed of the gospel, singular, which also goes back to our other point, for it is God's power for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and then also to the Greek. Well, if you're going to go to the Jews first, why don't you go to the Jews first with the book that was addressed to the Jews? That makes sense for it to be the first one.
Yeah, what you're going to see as we go through this week and next week, especially, are the emphasis of each of the gospel accounts. And Matthew's got tons of parables on the kingdom. Luke has the most parables, as you'll find out. I grew up thinking, and even the first few years I taught at Lipscomb when I started teaching Harmony of the Gospels when I came back from Hebrew Union. I thought the most parables were in Matthew, and taught Harmony of the Gospels, never questioned that. And then Dr. Baxter came to me and said, what we'd like you to do, is we're going to still teach you the freshman course, Harmony of the Gospel, want you to still be involved in that. But we're going to offer Matthew by itself sometime. We're going to offer Mark by itself, Luke by itself, and John. And so when I got to Luke and studied his parables in great detail, I found out he had the most parables. He had the most unique parables. He had something like 19 or 20 parables that were not in Mark or John or Matthew. And that was surprising. I started asking my students, what's your favorite parable? I'm going to say, Cheryl, what's your favorite parable? I won't hit her with that because she hadn't thought about it. But she might say, the prodigal son, only in Luke.
Luke 15.
Good Samaritan, only in Luke.
Luke 10.
Pharisee and publican, only in Luke.
Can't remember which chapter.
And so anyway, there are several parables that are people's favorite parables, but they're only in Luke's gospel, and they have a lot to do with grace. So we're trying to point, and then John, he writes last, in my opinion. John writes last, and the other three gospels are circulate. And by the way, there were gospels that didn't make the canon. The word canon comes from the word reed, a measuring stick. Measuring. They didn't measure up. They weren't looked upon as inspired and belonged to the Bible. And so John wrote last, and he has some discourses that are really unusual. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, that's great. So take us into Mark. This is your core, your core content here.
Right. One of the problems we had was it's just like when Stan got up today and at the beginning, how long did it take you to put that together? Hour?
About 55 minutes.
Yeah, and because we're trying to think things out and all, and so we talked 2 or 3 times this week, and yesterday we were on the phone for 2 hours, something like 2 hours, going over things, and I had reduced my Mark. I had, when I got finished with making notes on Mark that I wanted to share with you, it was 14 pages. 14 pages. And when I sent it to Stan to put on PowerPoint, I had got it down to 4. It was 4 basic pages that I put down. But that's how much information is here.
And you said something else, too. He said, I don't know about you, but I'm spending so much time on doing the research. Like, you read an article on Mark, and then someone suggests something, and you kind of scratch your head and go, well, where are they getting that? And you find in the footnote the source, and then you're off to that source, and then you're in another 2 hours reading that, going, how did they get from that,
right,
glean the point they put in the original one? And the next thing you know, we've spent more time doing construction for the lesson of this class than our day jobs. So.
Juanita passed my office door several times. She said, why are you guys laughing so much? Well, the cartoon, we just had a lot of fun, doing that. But now, I've been teaching the Gospels, even though, I ended up getting a doctorate in Old Testament. Been teaching the Gospels for longer than Stan's been alive. I started teaching the Gospels in 1972, Harmony of the Gospels. And so anyway, you just keep on learning, and that's one of the things that we're enjoying so much, how much we learn.
So the other thing that's needs to be stated right here, even though that clock is 2 minutes fast, so it's only 10:39, is Mark has a fast tempo. He seems to be in a hurry. And the longer we talk about things before Mark, you'll be in just as a hurried up state.
Right. Now, it's really amazing. If we took a poll here about your favorite gospel, very few people would pick out Mark. I think because the Sermon on the Mount is so important, in Matthew, and all his parables. And then you go to, jump to Luke, and Luke, like I said, has a tremendous number of parables. He also has a story about the birth of Jesus as well as Matthew, but the two stories differ. Luke's story is at the birth of Jesus when the shepherds came. Matthew's story is different. Matthew's story is after, you see, several months later. And who appears there? The wise men. The shepherds and the wise men do not appear at the same time. I know you're convinced they do because you've seen Macy's and other stores, and they're together. Or you've seen so many pictures where the wise men and the shepherds are together. But Jesus is a newly born, and those of you who've been to Israel have been to the shepherd's field, most likely, and probably one of those caves traditionally is where Jesus was born. And you brought the animals in with you and all that. But then the wise men come sometime later, maybe even a year later. Remember, Herod wanted all the babes up to 2 years old killed. Not just a few days old killed, but all the babes up to 2 years old to make sure that he got Jesus there.
But you just stumbled into a fascinating idea.
Fascinating, okay.
About Mark.
All right.
You said on the previous slide, you said Mark is not a natural choice as a favorite account of Jesus' deeds, teachings, death, and resurrection. And you almost answered it while you were going through those stories. Maybe it's because we feel like it's incomplete. The other ones seem to round out the rest of the story.
Right.
Mark doesn't have a birth narrative. He doesn't have a genealogy. He just gets going with Jesus as an adult. Right. So maybe it's because people want to know the whole story and not just kind of the nucleus of the story.
Right. Yeah, you start with Jesus out there preaching, and you get John's gospel. You'll see when Stan does that next week. There's 18 verses at the beginning talking about the pre-existence of Christ, the Logos, and all of a sudden the Logos turns into Jesus in verse 19. So anyway, let's just go. We'll just go through the slides. When you think of Matthew, you know he is a companion of Jesus. He's there in Galilee, and he's working with these other apostles up there. And when you jump to Luke, you know he was a companion of Paul. And when you go to John, you know John again is not only a relative of Jesus, but he's a fisherman there working with Peter and all. But Mark comes in to play in the book of Acts. You don't really know Mark until the book of Acts. As Stan talked about them, not really talking much about themselves. You take Mark. He doesn't occur in his gospel unless, and I think later on we have it.
No, it's right here.
Oh, okay.
Mark is not mentioned as an eyewitness in the accounts of Jesus' life unless, as some scholars insist, he is the young man who fled naked into the night when the Roman soldiers came to take Jesus as prisoner in Mark chapter 14, verses 51 and 52.
Yeah, they're in the Garden of Gethsemane, and the Roman soldiers come, and
someone's following them.
Yeah, so this young man, when chaos breaks out and Peter whacks off the ear of Malchus and all that happens, this young man panics. And he takes off, and somebody grabs his cloak, and he speeds away in the night naked. Well, now naked is the Greek word gym. The word gym comes from the Greek word gymnastics and gym, because they dress so much like in your underwear or something very. It doesn't really necessarily mean naked as we think. But maybe it was, though. But he fled into the night naked, and ancient scholars and many modern scholars said, this is Mark. He's mentioning himself. It's like in John's gospel, he mentions himself, but he doesn't call himself by name, the one who leaned on Jesus' breast and things like that, you see. And so these accounts do not. So Mark, we learn all about Mark when we get into the book of Acts, because he's all over the book of Acts.
That's what you say next. Luke tells us quite a bit about Mark in the book of Acts. John Mark, as he is also called, is first mentioned as the son of a woman named Mary, whose house was being used as a place for believers to gather and pray in Acts 12, verse 12.
So here we have another person you meet in the book of Acts is Barnabas. Well, they're related. Many translations say cousin. Some translations say, a couple of them say nephew. And so sometimes in the commentary say a relative. But there's somebody he's very, very close to. And so Mark does appear there. Now, we see him. He's in the book of Acts quite a bit. And he's going to end up not only working with Paul, he's going to end up, and Barnabas, and then going by Barnabas by himself. He's going to also later end up with Peter. So he's an unusual man. And what happened, of course, the reason for this slide is telling you that we don't know because of immaturity, we don't know of being afraid, we don't know of really the reason for it. But when they left Cyprus and went to Pamphylia, went to Asia Minor, Turkey, eastern Turkey, John Mark deserts them and goes back home. And this did not hit well with Paul. He was very upset about this. So later on, as we were telling you here on the slide, later on, when Paul gets ready to go back the area, Barnabas said, great, I'm all for it, let's do it. But let's take John Mark. And Paul said, not on your life. He just absolutely, they have a very sharp division among them over this point. And so Paul takes Silas, Barnabas takes John Mark, and they end up going to Cyprus. And by the way, that was the home territory of both Barnabas and Mark, according to some comments made in ancient scholars. They were like Hellenistic Jews, and we're going to talk a little more about Hellenistic Jews next week. One of the theories about Luke is that he wasn't a Gentile, as everybody says. He was a Hellenistic Jew. But that's for next week.
And you say here, fortunately, that is not the end of the story.
Yeah, it's people need to know. It's like when you're talking about Thomas, and people say, oh, that's doubting Thomas. Well, there are other passages. There's a passage where Jesus is insisting on going back to Jerusalem, and the disciples say, this is not a good idea. And Thomas speaks up and says, well, if he's going, let's go and die with him. And people forget that. That's that tells us something about his character. But in any case here, notice that years later, here's Paul saying, calls him a fellow worker in Philemon. And then to me, as I said, even more heartening near the end of his life, get Mark and bring him with you, he tells Timothy, because he is helpful to me in my ministry. So that's a comment made to him. And so obviously John Mark had matured or whatever took the case, but he ended up being a very, very important dedicated servant. Okay, quickly these 5 points. I had about 20, and I didn't know which ones to pick out. I said, well, I want to pick out ones that our audience maybe is not as familiar with. So here's this most interesting Greek word that is translated straightforward, straight away, immediately. Immediately is a good translation of it. But Marcus has you moving along. He has Jesus. The emphasis is going to be not as much as you'll see in a minute on his words and his speeches. The emphasis is going to be the activity going on and the rapid movement of it, as I put, this word is used 41 times in Mark's gospel, or on average over twice per chapter, and it actually a lot at the very beginning of it, but it creates a feeling of rapidly moving along in actions. All right, let's go to the next one. Yeah, this is probably maybe too technical a point. I'll try to Stan and I had a good time talking about this. You have a lot of times, let's just go with the life of David, which we'll come to one of these weeks. And the statement could say, and David had told Nathan this, or David had saw Bathsheba in the past tense. But occasionally, what happens with John occasionally and Mark a lot, he will switch to present tense instead of saying, yeah, and this person did this and this in the past. He said the person is doing this, and so David. Let's say we're talking about David, and David is saying to Nathan, brings you into the picture. And it's called in the language is historical present tense. And so I think that when you notice it and you see that the chance of tense, he just brings you right into the picture.
I actually did it this morning.
You actually did it this morning?
I said Dr. Martin Luther King is
Yes.
a theologian.
And I noticed you did that. I don't think I would have noticed it
if we hadn't had this conversation. But he is a theologian because, thanks to Jesus, people are not was. They may not be with us. Granted, we're separated from them temporarily, but it's not like they're gone. And so I think sometimes even when we do funerals, there's a very quick decision to put a person in past tense as they were a good man or they were a good woman. Well, they still are. They're just not here with us right now, but they are still a good man or a good woman, thanks to Jesus.
Okay, point number 3, we'll move to. This is one that I spent a lot of time on because it's been something that reoccurs in my career of teaching over and over again. And I said, well, how can I still want to mention it. Luke writes in this very eloquent, highly educated Dr. Luke vocabulary. And you can tell that he's a highly educated person, using medical terms and things of that nature. So, and you have John, when we teach people Greek, almost always the first Greek you actually read as a student is John's Gospel because it is simple Greek. Now, the meanings aren't simple. He's going to talk about a simple word like logos, but there's a lot packed into the word logos. The word in the beginning was the logos. There's a lot, but it's easy to read in Greek for the student, you see. And so Matthew, there is to me a Jewish flavor to Matthew's gospel, but
I have to tell him what you said about this.
Okay, yeah.
I got to this one and I was like, one sentence, Dr. Cloud? And he said, oh, I had a whole bunch, but I just took it all down to just one sentence. It would have been too much.
Yeah, it's he writes in street Greek is another term. I don't know if I use that. No, I use everyday Greek. He writes, and so he's been criticized by critical scholars, by really not knowing. Did he really not know Greek very, very well? No, he's writing in a different kind of Greek. I was involved in the version for the deaf. Of course, I really enjoyed this morning what they were doing, and I was able, I'm not an expert in it, but able to learn some of the language because my secretary was the president of the DAC club at Lipscomb, and she was an English major. She was my top Greek and my top Hebrew student. So when I did the version of the deaf, I'd come in and we couldn't use any English above the 4th grade. It had to be 4th grade or under. We could use. She'd say, Dr. Cloud, you can't use this word. You can't use that word. And then again, you have all these English translations, contemporary English, dynamic equivalent, paraphrases, and so that again, Mark is doing what he's doing on purpose, so he shouldn't be criticized for it. Okay, I'll make this very quickly. The emphasis, as we've hinted at a few times, was that Mark is concentrating on actions and movement, and he is not giving long speeches. There is, in one chapter, Mark has some, but he has very few parables. He is talking about what Christians are doing. This is what they're doing. This is what they're not doing. This is how they need to be corrected. And so he really spends a lot of time focusing on actions.
I found this very interesting that you put in there. Oddly, Jesus does not expound and exegete in Mark's account of the gospel as he does in the other three. So like when the apostles would say something like, what does this mean? And he would pull them aside and explain it. There's no explaining in Mark.
That's right. So it's just different, okay? And the fifth point is a tremendous emphasis on discipleship. And we have a lot of emphasis here at this congregation on discipleship, but I could have gone on and on and on about that. But, go as you go, the whole concept is people making them like Jesus, teaching them how to be disciples, how to love, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so, yeah,
I really liked your point there at the bottom where you said that the 12 are shown in Mark to fail and fail again, but Jesus does not break faith with them, but rather continues to patiently teach them. So it may not be a succinct sentence like in Matthew 28, go and make disciples. It's more of a, here's how you make disciples, and every time you fall short and fall down, just, I'm here to, Jesus speaking, I'm here to get you back up and send you back out again.
Correct. Okay. Go ahead, comment on this.
Well, I had to throw in one slot on Mark, just ask him. I said, I don't want to sound like I'm hoarding in on your assignment. But the Gospel of Mark was likely written to persuade Gentile readers in Rome that Jesus' death on the cross, a shameful form of execution in Roman society, did not invalidate his claims to messiahship and deity or his proclamation of the kingdom of God, but rather that his resurrection, miracles, and prediction of his death vindicated his claims. I think what they're saying there, whoever wrote that, what they're saying is that Mark is not trying to set up all the explanation of the facts of the crucifixion being something that are criticized to say, well, surely, I mean, first of all, I guess you would say if they didn't understand the Messiah had to die, which, Jesus has that conversation with them, but if they're actually critiquing on how he died, as if he died the death of somebody that type of death is not worthy of the Messiah, it gets a little bit kind of close to comical that anybody would nitpick over how someone died to whether or not that qualifies them to be accepted of what they say and who they say they are. And so Mark is not doing that. Mark's doing the other. He's showing you all the deeds Jesus did so that anything that would detract from Jesus being the Messiah because of any of the factual points around his crucifixion and how he was treated and how when Pilate asked him, do you have anything to say? And he didn't say anything. He went silent like a lamb led to the slaughter. Mark is showing you why that doesn't mean that disqualifies him from being the Messiah because of all the stuff that he actually did do that proved he actually was the Messiah, the healing of people and the coming of the kingdom and the teachings and the knowledge of Scripture. So it is an action versus labeling, I think, perspective. So finally, we're going over heroes of faith. We consider the authors of the accounts of the gospel to be heroes of faith. Matthew, we just had a summary statement that says, is a fantastic tapestry of literature arranged in a way that presents Jesus as the ultimate Jewish protagonist, the messianic son of David, the prophet who surpasses Moses, and the seed of Abraham that blesses all the nations. And then do you want to read Mark?
No, you go ahead.
And then Mark's summary statement is, Mark is organized into 7 sections that describe the life and ministry of Jesus Christ. The book has no story of Jesus' birth. Instead, the first section of the story begins by describing Jesus' adult life, introducing it and the words, the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, Mark 1:1. The evangelist demonstrates that Jesus is Israel's Messiah who inaugurates God's kingdom through his suffering, death, and resurrection. And that leads us to next week. We will cover Luke and John.
I wish I'd done more on miracles, but anyway, there's just so much we left out. Would you bow with us. Our gracious, kind Heavenly Father, we so much enjoy digging deeply into your word and learning more about you, your Son, the Holy Spirit. Thank you so much for preserving it for us. And thank you so much for making it so meaningful. And Father, may these lessons bless the